3.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar question and answer session with the Director for Education, Nick Batchelar, and Cabinet Member and Deputy Leader, Cllr Sarah Merry. So this is for pupils to receive information around the plans to reopen school after the announcement from Welsh Government, and to ask questions that you feel you would like the answers to make sure that you're informed, and maybe you can share that information with your friends and family. You'll hear from Nick Batchelar and from Cllr Sarah Merry. They'll introduce themselves, they'll tell you a little bit of information, and then you'll be able to ask questions using the chat function on the right-hand side. So we can't see you, we can't hear you, so be brave and make sure you get any of those questions into the chat when we ask you to. And the way that we're going to start that is we're going to ask primary school children from year 6 from across the city to be able to put those questions in first. So that way, if they need to leave, they're more than free to do that. But we will be taking as many questions as we can from both secondary and primary around the reopening of schools. So without further ado, what we're going to do is we'll hand over to Nick and Sarah to introduce themselves, and then you'll receive some information. So I'll hand over to Nick Batchelar.
Hello everyone, and I'm really pleased to be joining you this afternoon, and thank you for making the effort to tune in. So first of all, I'd just like to explain who I am and what I do. I'm the Director of Education in Cardiff, and so I'm not a politician, I'm a paid officer of the council, and my main job is to be responsible for how education works in Cardiff. And so I don't teach anyone. I used to be a teacher, but I don't teach now. But I work very closely with head teachers, with governors and governing bodies, and I visit schools, and I'm very interested in what's going on. And I'm obviously part of, have an important role in making decisions about the future of schools in Cardiff. And I offer advice to Cllr Sarah Merry, who you'll meet in just a minute, and to the wider cabinet about the big decisions that have to be taken. I don't take the decisions. For the most part, the big decisions are taken by the politicians. But my job is to make sure that they have the right information for doing that. I'm really interested in what young people think about schools, and I'm absolutely delighted that Cardiff is one of the cities in the UK that is aiming to be a child-friendly city. And particularly right now, when there's such a lot of change in all our lives, we're really keen to make sure we know what young people think about what's happening now and what should happen next. So I'll say a bit more in a minute, but I'll hand over to Sarah Merry now.
Hi, hello everybody. My name's Sarah Merry and I'm the Cabinet Member for Education at Cardiff Council. I am an elected politician. I'm a councillor for Caerdydd, and I have to be elected to that every few years. But I'm also the Cabinet Member for Education, which is a post that the leader of the council appoints a councillor to. So I'm very lucky to be in a role that I really enjoy doing. I'm not a paid professional, I'm not a teacher, and I've never been a teacher. I suppose I'm more here to kind of like ask the same kind of questions that your parents would be asking about your education. And also we make the decisions, the big decisions as Nick calls them, on the basis of advice we get. Or we will say, well, one of the things that is really important to us is closing the education gap. How are we going to do it? What are your ideas about how we're going to do it? So that's the way it works. We make the big decisions and we take the blame, and then Nick gives us the advice to make the decisions. So I pass back to Nick now.
Thank you, Sarah. So let me just say a bit about the thing we're focusing on today, which is how should schools gradually start taking pupils back. So I'm going to start with a few dates, and I'll start going back to March. Now you'll remember that fairly suddenly in March, in fact, it was over a period of about 3 days. We had to organise the closure of all schools and that was March the 23rd. And suddenly, life changed very, very significantly. So we didn't have schools operating in the normal way. Lots of people had to work from home, and we had to take huge amounts of care about who we came into contact with. And there was a lot of surprise, shock and anxiety around at the time, I think. Now, what we did do with some schools was open them as hubs for the children of key workers. Key workers were defined as people who had to work in essential services during the first phase of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was particularly health workers, but other essential services like ambulance workers, police, fire, and also people who worked in other roles as well. And so some schools were open, so some of you will have been going to hub schools, I'm sure, and some children have been able to access hub provision, but it wasn't anything like normal school, as everyone knows. And then back in the middle of May the 15th, the Welsh Government announced an approach to starting schools again. And what they said at the time was they were not going to bring schools back at the beginning of June. You're probably aware that's what was suggested for England, but Welsh Government said then they're going to take a different approach. And that was partly because the rate of spread of the virus was different in Wales, and also decisions about education in Wales are the responsibility of the elected politicians in Wales. Kirsty Williams is the minister in the Welsh Assembly government. Then on the 3rd of June, the announcement was made that schools would increase their operations from the 29th of June, and that there would be an extra week added on to the summer term, and that week would be, if you like, borrowed from the October half term. So you'd have a 2-week October half term. And the suggestion about schools beginning to restart has caused lots of attention, and that's really what we want to focus on. Let me just say 3 things about that decision. One was, it's obviously a difficult decision, and it was partly based on an assessment of the impact of opening schools again gradually on health matters. And it's very important that the health condition is right before young people and their teachers start going back to school. Secondly, there was obviously lots and lots of concern about the longer that schools were closed, about how damaging this might be for many, many young people, for a whole range of reasons. And thirdly, there was a question about, well, who should decide what happens in each school? Should it be the head teacher, the governing body, me, Cllr Merry, or Kirsty Williams, the Minister of Education? And broadly, what's been decided in Wales is that there should be a gradual restart of schools, nothing like normal schools, but some opportunity for every child who attends of so-called statutory school age to be able to go back to their school for some time, and that might not be much time in the summer term before the end of term, to reconnect with some of their classmates, but probably not all, to reconnect with some of their teachers, and also to gain an understanding of what schools are like when you have to have this physical distancing in place, so that when schools come back in September, and they'll be broadly the same as they will be in June, there'll be far fewer pupils, there'll be lots of separation, there'll be lots of rules that are not the sort of rules you normally have to have in place. So the purpose of schools starting again in Wales is not to cram everyone into school again and say, get learning, catch up on all the learning that you might have missed. That isn't the point of it. It's really to make sure that those important contacts are made, that everyone before the summer holiday break knows what to expect when they come back in September. So that's what we're really interested in getting your views on, because a lot of that is being decided this week, next week, and before, in the run-in to the 29th. And there are a number of ways we can do it, and we want to do it in the way that is safest, is most effective, and gives the most confidence to everyone who has anything to do with the school. So I'll hand over to Councillor Merry now, and then look forward to some of your questions coming up on the Q&A.
So Nick talked about us wanting to be a child-friendly city, which is part of the reason for doing this today. Lots of you will have different feelings about the schools being open again. Some of you may be excited about seeing your friends. Some of you may be nervous about going back into school, worried what the rules will be. And some of you may be both excited and scared all at the same time and not knowing what is going to happen. Now, we may not be able to answer all of your questions, because part of actually talking to you now is actually knowing what is concerning you and what you would like to see when you go back to school, and that is really important to us. Usually when we're doing things with schools, we've got a way of doing things, and it's the way that people do it every year. And have done for several years, and this is going to be different. And just as you're going to be getting used to going back into school, the teachers and the staff are going to be getting used to actually how they run a school at the moment. So knowing what you're thinking and what you're worried about will help us make the right decisions, and that really is important to us. So looking forward to answering your questions.
So I'm looking at some of the questions that have come through. They're really good questions, and be prepared for me and Sarah saying, well, we don't know yet, because we don't know we haven't decided all the answers to all the questions. So if I could start with Fatima's question about transition for year 6 going into secondary school, and I think Tess Furlong from Roedden Primary, you're probably talking about that as well. That is a particular area of concern, because normally at this time of year, schools organise all kinds of visits to make sure that year 6 pupils going into year 7 feel confident. They know their way around the school they're going to be starting at in September. They've met some of the teachers, they've met some of the other pupils. Now, obviously at the moment that can't happen, and one of the questions that I've been talking about with head teachers this morning, in fact, is, well, how could we do some of that safely in the 4 weeks that we will have of term? And I think we need some bright ideas on that. So it's, yes, we are very keen to make sure that that transition and that start in September is smooth and effective and not unsettling, but we have to find new ways of making that happen, and obviously bringing lots of people together from different schools, different homes, different places in the city. That needs very careful handling, because one of the things that all of us have got to do is to make sure that we're not doing anything which risks spreading the virus. So that isn't a simple answer, but other than to say it's a very tricky question. I'll also just answer, or attempt to answer, a couple of others. Anonymous, whoever Anonymous is, hello, whoever you are, says, will I need to bring a packed lunch? Probably yes. I mean, interestingly, we've been discussing this in some detail. So we think probably the best way to manage things will be for everyone who goes to school on whatever day it is that your school asks you to come in to bring a packed lunch. But it may be that some schools who run their own catering want to do it differently. But the most likely answer to that question is yes. Are we going to be allowed to play outside? Well, I very much hope so, because one of the things that you probably all know about is that the COVID virus doesn't particularly like sunlight, and it finds it much more difficult to latch on to new people, which is the thing it wants to do, in the outdoors. It's also much easier outdoors to be distanced from each other. So as long as contact can be managed outdoors and play respects the need to keep distance, so you can't kind of huddle up as you might do with all your friends and be very close to them, or kind of play games with them which involve physical contact. But being outside is a really important part of managing social distancing in school, and it's one reason why having an extra week on the summer term is a good thing, as long as the weather stays nice. So there are some thoughts on that. There's one about how long will the school's days be and what time will they start. Sarah, do you want to come in on that, because we talked about that this morning a bit?
Hi, before I move on to that, could I just say something about the secondary school question? I think that's a really good question, because I know how nervous my children were when they were moving up to secondary school. And I think we need to look at any ideas that people have got. I mean, the obvious things, people would talk about online and meeting that way, but of course we have to keep you all safe, and there's sometimes difficulties about how we do things online as well. But obviously we'll have to look at all the possibilities. In terms of questions around the school day, we're still getting guidance and details, but what we were told was the most that any of the pupils would be in at any one time would just be a third of the school, and that would be the most, with the suggestion as well that some children may start earlier and some may come in later, but that's the kind of information that we're going to have to discuss with all the head teachers. And then share with you after decisions have been made. And actually things may vary between schools as well. Some schools have much less space than others, so if you're wanting to keep pupils spaced out, it's much harder for some schools than others, and all those kinds of things are going to play into how we make a decision. And it may not be that everybody is actually going to be in for the same time, depending on which school they are. Okay.
So I can see more questions coming along. You're asking some cracking good questions, I must say. So there's two groups of questions I'm going to try and respond to now. One from Hamish and some other people about transport, getting to school. I've lost the question now, and Thelonious, yeah. So you're both asking about transport and getting to school. Now, really good questions, because Thelonious, you're asking specifically about how safe is it to travel on trains, and that's an important consideration, and obviously lots of other young people have to travel on buses. So our transport colleagues in the council are in touch with schools about how we can arrange to get young people safely to school, and obviously it's absolutely vital that travelling to school is safe, just as it's important that being in school is safe. And I think there are some real challenges there. In terms of trains, I think we need to look at that really, really hard. And where necessary, we need to make sure that we've got other arrangements that can get youngsters to school if that's possible. In some cases, we're going to have far fewer young people going to a particular school, because what we won't have for sure is a school bus going around the city and gradually getting more and more full, so that you can't have any physical distancing inside the bus. That wouldn't be appropriate. So that's why we're going to have to plan very carefully with schools which pupils the school wants to come in on which day, and then we'll have to also then look at how much transport can we provide to enable those young people to get to school. And if it's not possible to get everyone to school safely, then not everyone will be able to go to school on that day. They will have to be scheduled to go to school on a different day. The one thing I hope you're all picking up about this is that whilst everyone will have an opportunity to go back to school for some time, most pupils at any one time won't be in school. Welsh Government have suggested that, as a rough guide, 1/3 of pupils will be in the school at any one time. So that means that 2/3 will be back at home. So the main way of learning for the rest of this term will have to be learning remotely, learning online, learning through materials that have been sent to you. So that's on transport. The other question that has come from Umaima and some others is what safety precautions will be put in place in schools before any pupils return. So we're planning to get the schools open from at least the week before any pupils go back, so that staff are able to reorganise the classrooms. That means taking some tables out, changing the furniture layout, probably putting one-way systems in so that you don't have crowded corridors, putting lots of hand washing in, whether that's hand sanitizers or different ways of providing access to hand washing and toilets. So quite a lot of things will need to be done and put in place, and we're in discussion with schools at the moment about this. And then related to that, there's a question about will we have to wear masks? And there's lots and lots of discussion about masks. Do they make a difference? Don't they make a difference? Should they be worn or not? The Welsh Government's Chief Medical Officer advice is that for schools, that's staff and pupils returning, there is no requirement that everyone wears masks. However, in some circumstances, there is a need for masks to be worn and some other protective gowns. For example, if a pupil falls ill or falls over and hurts themselves, then somebody needs to provide first aid and care. And that means getting up close, it means touching the pupil and having physical contact. So in those circumstances, yes, masks should be worn, gowns should be worn, gloves should be worn. But for the most part, the view in Wales at the moment is that you would not have to wear a mask when you go to school. So school uniform, are we going to wear our school uniform? That came up, you might be interested to know, with head teachers this morning. And there are different views on that. I think if it's easier to have not school uniform in terms of washing clothes more easily, if you've only got one set of school uniform, it's rather difficult to wash it and dry it in time. So I think probably there will be an expectation that uniform is not required for this period, but we'll have to see on that. Let me see, we're beginning to move into some of the older pupils here. So I can see I can see we've covered quite a few of the questions coming through. I can see Isla, you're asking, are we allowed to play sports? I think the answer is partly yes and partly no. What clearly can't be done is contact sports, where you're coming into physical contact with others. Some sports now can be played safely, but in a very controlled way. So I think that's something that the specialist sports teachers in each school are going to have to work out with advice from my officers and from Welsh Government. In fact, that's a particularly good question to think about. Sarah, are there any more of the questions that are of a more general nature before we move on to the ones that are particularly about secondary school pupils you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think there is one that we didn't mention there, which was about multi-generational households, but that also it could be where children are living with other people who are shielding, which are the ones who have to stay inside. Now it depends on the personal circumstances of a family, but children are not necessarily going to be expected to go to school if they are living with somebody who is what they call shielding. So it will depend on each child as to whether or not they are, whether they do go back to school. I just wanted to highlight that one because I thought it was a really important question, particularly if you say living with your grandma and she's one of those people who have to stay inside. You don't necessarily have to go back to school.
So I'm going to pick up on some of the questions that have obviously come from older pupils in terms of secondary schools, and it's interesting that how many of the questions are about transition, points of transition. So there's a question from someone, no name. Will the year 11 students go back during the 4-week term to help to decide what to take at A level? And I think someone else has asked exactly that question. Yes, absolutely. So I think it's, I've got particular concerns around points of transition. So let's go through what those are. So children going to school, formal schooling for the first time in year R, they're a real concern. As we've already said, year 6 pupils going into year 7, that's a concern for all the reasons we know. This is normally the time when you build the confidence. Year 11 pupils leaving, completing GCSEs, and then perhaps going on to take A-level courses in either their own school or another school or in a college, or going to an apprenticeship. So year 11 students at a point of transition, they're a particular concern. And then year 13 students who might be looking to go on to university or enter work or further training. So I think we have real concerns around all those points of transition, and our Education Partnership Board, which is a body that Sarah and myself sit on, together with employers, higher education representatives, further education, school head teachers, governors, lots of other people. That's something we've had quite a lengthy discussion about last week, and everyone agreed that we must all do what we can to try and support young people who are at those points of transition and make sure they're not unfairly damaged by what happening to be in year 11, for example, in 2020. So a related concern has come from one of you. I can't find the name again, sorry, but it's about it's Kai from Plasma. So it's hard for year 12 students like me who usually do well and exceed expectations in summer exams. How can you ensure we're not disadvantaged by this, and will there be any changes to the exams next year? Well, that's another key concern. because obviously the normal method for awarding grades for courses and study through exam or coursework have been suspended, and much depends on your previous record of achievement and the assessment of your teacher. Now, for some people, they may think, well, that's great, but others might feel that actually they're going to be shortchanged by that. And again, at the partnership board meeting that I've just been talking about, we have a representative from Cardiff Youth Council there, and he was talking very, very clearly about the concern from many year 11s, year 12s, and year 13 students that their grades will be perceived as being somehow not valid or without the status they'd normally have, and that's a very real concern. So we are raising those worries with the exam boards in Wales and with Philip Blaker, the chief executive of the exam board. I can't give you an absolute guarantee that you won't be disadvantaged, but I can assure you that we're all talking about it. Let me see. Where else shall we go? We're back to families. What will happen with the year 11s whose exams are now over? Well, from Caris, that strange enough, I've just this minute been discussing that with colleagues about starting. It depends what your plans are, Caris, but if your plans are to continue in full-time education in the school system, then there is no reason why you shouldn't be able to start the courses that you aspire to follow next year in this summer period. And lots of schools are already putting those arrangements in place. And similarly, I believe there's arrangements with the Cardiff and the Vale College to have a similar arrangement where you could start now, because clearly you don't want to return during this 4-week period and do stuff that you don't need to do. Equally, if you didn't go back now, you would have been away from more formal learning for an awfully long time, and that's not a good way to start a new part or a new phase of your education. So I hope very much that for year 11s whose exams are now over, they would be able to, if you like, jump ahead and get on to their next program of study sooner rather than later. There's a question here about which, Sarah, you might like to come in on, because you and I have spoken a lot about this, about provision for children and young people who are vulnerable. Would you like to just kind of share some of the thoughts that you've discussed with me and with some of my colleagues about that?
Yeah. Whether a child is classed as vulnerable or not, there's all kinds of reasons why they may find it harder to get going back into school as time goes by. Not everybody has got the same IT equipment at home. Not everybody has got the same access to broadband. If you're in a large family, even if you've got broadband, you may be squabbling with your brothers and sisters about who's getting on there as people are streaming things. And we're very worried that basically some children will have missed out more over the last few weeks than others, and we were discussing this on the Education Development Board, as Nick said. So that's something that we're really going to be looking at very closely, and we're also going to have somebody from the Youth Council actually come and speak to our next board meeting with some of the ideas that he's had coming out of the pandemic about how we actually teach. But I think as well, there's lots of lessons that we can actually learn from the last few weeks. So some people actually may have enjoyed the fact that they're learning remotely, if it's worked for them. We've got pupils who are not in school normally, and it may be that we've learned a lot of important lessons about actually how people can learn online. So that is going to be important as well. But I think part of the reason why the Welsh Minister decided that schools should go back for a period over the summer term was actually so we could check up on pupils and actually make sure that they had been coping, how they've been coping during that gap, and take lessons from that about what we need to do going forwards in September. So I think the saddest thing when I've been reading the questions is when you've all been worried about what this will mean for you long term. I can't give you a promise that there won't be any impact over the longer term, but we're going to work and do everything that we can to try and make sure that there isn't a long-term impact. And actually we're open to hearing your ideas as well, because unless we actually know what the problems are that you faced over the last few weeks, it's hard for us to come up with solutions. So, you know, we want to hear from you too, and it's going to be a really important part of our work over the next few months or even next year. The other thing is that we know that those pupils who have just finished their GCSEs or who've just finished their A levels, I think we need to think of ways to make sure that you don't feel that you've been abandoned. Just because your exams have finished, it doesn't mean that you're not, you know, one of our pupils, for want of the best word, or one of our children, and we're going to be wanting to do the very best for everybody who's been left in that situation, so that you don't feel that you've been left high and dry. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I'd absolutely echo that about concerns. And so we've talked about a number of areas so far. And I can see the questions are still coming in about points, young learners at points of transition. So Kai from Plasmar, you've asked a really good one about supporting young people into apprenticeships and future youth employment. That's a real concern. And so any ideas you have about how we can make sure that we don't have people coming out of school and then, as Sarah put it, feeling abandoned and lost, let's hear them. We'd like to hear from them. So I would like to just touch on some of three other areas now that are coming up in a number of questions. One is, on a more practical level, how will it actually work? What would it be like? And so this is about equipment, groups, patterns of attendance and that sort of thing. So a number of you have raised the question about, will I have to take my own equipment? The chances are the answer will be largely yes. And if there is any shared equipment, it will need to be sanitized between being used. So obviously, the more personalization of contact, so for instance, in all probability, you will have a desk. That will be your desk. No one else will use the desk during the day. You know, normal secondary school pattern is you move around an awful lot. In the course of a day, about 8 different pupils probably sit in any one desk. Well, that absolutely won't work. So in primary schools, you may well have a lot of shared resources and, you know, a pot of pens that everyone in the class can make use of. That wouldn't apply as well. So I do think it will be very different, and you're asking absolutely the right question. So it will be much more your space, your place, your equipment. And if anyone else is to come in and use that space after you, it will need to be cleaned. So we are looking at putting in place 2 cleans through the school, through every school, in the course of a day. Clean at lunchtime and a clean at the end of the day. And then there's a question about groups. A number of you are asking about groups, and some of you are asking about bubbles. You know, this idea of social bubbles, so that you identify a certain number of people who are inside your bubble and you associate with them, but you don't associate with anyone who's outside your bubble. Now, to some extent, that model of using bubbles has been applied in England, and I would have to say it's one of the reasons why I think they're running into some difficulties at the moment. The view from Welsh Government and the specialists there, it seems to be that the bubble idea isn't essential in a safe return of schools. And so I think it's unlikely that we will be forced into establishing the notion of bubbles, that a certain set of of other pupils and teachers who you do associate with, and that means that you don't have any contact with anyone outside the bubble. However, some aspects of that will be carried forward into how we operate. There's a question about patterns of attendance that one of you has asked in relation partly to parents, and the parents, as we've discovered, schools play an important role in relation to learning, but they also play a very important role in terms of safety and care for young people, particularly younger young people, during the day. And what's quite clear is there will not be a single settled pattern of attendance for the 4 weeks of this term. There will be variability, which doesn't necessarily help parents in planning for their own childcare arrangements, their own care arrangements, particularly if we're talking about younger pupils. Now, I do know that schools will be, if you like, drawing up their timetable of who should attend when, with that in mind, but with only 1/3 of the overall population attending school at any one time, it would be impossible to have a more settled and regular pattern of attendance. So that's going to be difficult for you, and it will be difficult for your families as well, particularly if you're of an age where you can't be on your own in the daytime. So again, on the question about who attends when, Georgia Graham, you've asked a really good question, which is, why don't we just send the most prioritised students back to school? And so you're suggesting that would be year 6, year 11 and sixth formers. And now, I'm sure you're well aware that a decision was made in England to suggest that year 6, year 10 and 11 students all went back. And there's been a recognition today that that approach hasn't worked in the way that was originally intended. I think the key point about the approach outlined in Wales is that all students, regardless of the year they're in, need some opportunity to have contact with school. And the view has been taken, I have to say, I think rightly, that I would agree with this, that it wouldn't be right to give priority to a minority of students and say, actually, your learning matters more than everyone else's learning, and therefore the others have to stay at home. And the reason for that is that the primary purpose of this 4-week period at the end of this summer term is to, in the language of the Welsh Government announcement, check in, catch up and prepare. By catch up, they don't mean, fill in all the learning you haven't done in the time school's been closed. What they mean is reconnect, re-establish the social relationships and re-establish the approach to learning, which will enable you in the autumn to go on learning for the most part while you're still at home and on the days when you're able to attend school. The last point I'd like to comment on, and Lee, this might be, it's such a cracking good question. I think it might be one we could start drawing things together on, is, I've lost the question now because there are so many, but it's a really simple question, and often the simplest questions are the best. What are there we are, anonymous, whoever you are, it's a super question. What are the benefits of us being back at school? Well, what a good, absolutely good question to ask before we get lost in all the detail. I think I've partly answered that by what I've just said. Let me answer it by a slightly backwards approach, which is, well, if you didn't go back to school, what would the disbenefits, what would the damage be? I think that would be a hugely long time. So but by the time you start going back from the 29th of June, that will have been 14 weeks since March the 23rd. If nobody went back until the beginning of September, that would be a hugely long period where there would not have been any social and educational contact, direct contact, I mean, rather than online contact. So I think that's a primary purpose of the return as it's been designed in Wales. I think the learning benefit would be to support through some face-to-face contact with teachers and with other pupils, the online learning that you've been asked to do at home and I'm sure have been mostly doing. And I think the last area would be that schools play a very important role in providing safe places for young people to talk about the things they're worried about, the things that are causing them unhappiness and anxiety, you know, maybe to do with their relationships with other young people outside school, or maybe to do with difficulties at home. And without that network of support and opportunity to talk, I think an awful lot of young people would be quite at risk. So that's what I think the benefits are. I don't actually think the key benefit is to learn more in that 4-week period. That's not going to be the primary purpose. It's about supporting readiness to learn rather than learning in itself. So how are we doing, Lee? Can I bring you back in there? And I know we haven't answered every single question. There's lots more, but perhaps we could have a bit of conversation just to round off about the other ways in which we, with your support, are looking to work with young people in this next phase. Lee, your mic's not on.
Thank you. Yeah, excellent questions from 55 attendees from across 11 schools. We've published 68 questions and we have an additional 131 questions on top of that. So excellent, and thanks very much, Nick and Sarah, for sharing all the information pertinent to the pupils on board. As Nick has just outlined, we want to engage children and young people in the plans that are going to be made in the coming weeks and months. To do that, we will be running a second webinar event with a much wider group of people next Tuesday, that's the 16th. If you think that is a good idea, please can you just pop it into the chat, or if you think there is a way that it might be improved or enhanced in some way. We'd be very interested in your views if you think that this was beneficial and productive, and if we could get it better. The second opportunity that we would like to offer young people is to be part of a task group, a pupil task group that people like Nick and Sarah could actually use to generate ideas, to take soundings on views of the best way forward, to develop plans and what the lived experience is out there in schools. To make sure that the people making decisions and supporting head teachers are connected with the pupils themselves. So I put into the chat there how you might want to find more information about that, and it's simply sending an email to childfriendlycardiff@cardiff.gov.uk. We will be sending out information shortly to schools on the 24th of June about a competition, a big ideas competition, which is a summer challenge about how do we keep the city a great place to live, work and play. So keep an eye out for that. We would like you to generate lots of ideas, test it with your friends and families, and then submit it. and then we will work with our partners across the city, whether that be businesses or universities or colleges, to encourage them to dip into the pool of ideas and go fishing and pull them out. And if there is some way they can support those ideas in some way to make Cardiff keep going as a great place to live and work and play. So there's three things: an additional task group that we're setting up, another webinar, and then the ideas call. If you have any other ideas that you think would be really good for us to consider about how to engage children and young people, please do put it in the chat. And so you know what's going to happen next. All of this webinar was recorded. It was a pupil webinar, but we want people making decisions in schools to be informed about what the conversation and what the concerns or ideas are. So we will be sending this recording and we'll share the link with head teachers so they can consider what it looks like in their school and work alongside you. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks to Sarah and to Nick for taking the time out of a busy schedule, but it's important, as they've said, to be a child-friendly city. We look forward to working with you, receiving your emails, and thank you very much for contributing. We will see you again in the future. Thank you.